Welcome, everyone. The summit is now live. David, please take it away.
Thanks, Allison. Okay, welcome everyone to today's summit, the state of enterprise security in 2025, the biggest problems and best solutions, brought to you by Rubrik, a data security specialist. I'm David Rammel, here to moderate our first session and kick off a great expert-led event. But first, let's cover a few things. Today's event is being recorded, and you'll get a replay link in your inbox in the next few days. Next, each session will feature a live Q&A. Please submit your questions through the Q&A box at any point, and we'll address as many as possible at the end. Additionally, we have an exciting giveaway during our third session, a Nintendo Switch. To be eligible to win, you'll need to stay on until the end. Now, don't forget to explore the resources linked in your console. They go beyond what we'll cover today, including in-depth details about Rubrik, links to product demos, contact info so you can connect with some of our experts after the event ends, and more. And again, a big thank you to Rubrik for making this event possible. Their commitment to this community is what drives events like these. Now let's kick off the first session, top challenges to securing data across hybrid and multi-cloud. Our presenter is Chris Spinks, the head of operations for CTI company, Cyjax. He's also CEO of his own company, CyberForce Services. His experience comes from working in the cybersecurity space for the past decade, both from within UK law enforcement as a detective sergeant on police cyber teams and private sector. Chris has continued to lead teams with the cyberspace, bringing new talent to the industry through diverse recruitment strategies and rocking the cyber skills gap boat with new thought leadership and insight. Chris, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
Hey, thanks, David, and thank you ever so much for having me along. Yes, it's been a good career coming through, as you've said, really varied career, and I'll talk about that in a few seconds. But I would very much like to start by myself thanking Rubrik for having me along, a fantastic sponsor, and I know real drivers in this community. So a real privilege to be here, and yeah, absolutely wonderful. I was a police officer for 23 years. Normally I would talk about top challenges in securing data across hybrid and multi-cloud and jump straight into it, but actually this is going to be relevant. So I was a police officer for 23 years and worked across the UK, both in the good old bobby hat, walking the streets of our cities, and then moved into the covert roles where I was working with surveillance teams and undercover units, which was a lot of fun, always tracking threat actors, as we now call them, but criminals on our shores. On our shores was really useful because, generally speaking, we knew who they were and we knew what they were doing, and we could usually catch them in the act, which, as a police officer, is pretty relevant. And then I moved into the cyber area. I love cyber, I really do, but no one else did. And so when it came down to volunteers to start up new cyber teams and innovation teams working across the technology space, it was less of a case of me stepping forward and more a case of everyone else stepping back. So I was left then with the wonderful opportunity to develop new teams to target criminals acting in that cyberspace. And this really was the revelation, because even back then, and I'm talking a decade ago, the cyberspace was not a UK-centric thing. The cyberspace was very much global, very global. Still in the good old days of Anonymous, when they were busy, and as Anonymous we are Legion friends. But as I started to work across those cyber teams, we really saw the cyber threat landscape change. And that was what really gave me the experience to look at what those top challenges might be and get first-hand experiences of what do we do about it. And 3 years ago, I decided that I wanted to jump ship. I wanted to give myself a bit more of a challenge. Not that there is much more of a challenge than being law enforcement, but I wanted to start my own business. And at the same time got offered the head of operations role for a cyber threat intelligence company called Cyjax, which I have to say, seeing as I don't like my own personal time, was two pretty much full-time roles rolled into one. So whilst my family never get to see me, I do spend a lot of time looking at challenges and, well, helping our clients secure their data. So I've got a little bit of experience on this. And the great thing is that I am a keen cyclist and a trials rider. And most of the time I'm falling off my trials bike and injuring myself. And so sitting at my desk recovering from injury is quite a good place to be. So I thought we'd start off really by examining what we're looking at here. We're looking at data. Well, what is data? Data is information. And I thought it was important to just drill into this because it gives context to the challenge. It's really information, those facts, numbers, all collected, which are going to be examined, considered, and used by the business to help decision making. This is a base theme of a business. It's using data to enhance itself, to enable itself to increase profit, hopefully decrease loss, and really done by decisions that are related very much around risk. And of course, risk is both opportunity and negative risk. All of those data points coming in to feed decision-making around that risk. So critical. Data is critical in that way. And of course, it's opportunities for growth. Looking at what's happened before, looking at what's happening currently, and where we can optimize around that as a business. And that's giving us that potential growth and allowing strategy to be built. So really, that data is critical to business. Now, we all know this. It's absolutely no surprise to you. This is our core function as a business. But this is why that business needs the data to be available. And it could be data, information, facts, numbers, personally identifiable information around our clients or around our supply chains. And so real critical information there, again, which really needs to be secure, because that not only leads to problems for our own intellectual property, but also, people get rather annoyed if you lose their data. Those regulators come rolling in, and we'll talk about fines in a little bit. But also just allowing us to understand our processes within the business. Not only details of the process, which can be really sensitive at times, but also our intention of future processes. Well, it's a competitive space out there. The challenge in securing that is real, to not only secure our future opportunity, but also stop others getting that competitive advantage. So we're really looking at CIA. And not the CIA that infiltrates the world and does some wonderful work, but confidentiality, availability, and integrity. Now, as all of us are practitioners and data experts, we're all well used to our CIA acronym. But we just want to spend a couple of minutes thinking about that, because this is what we're trying to secure for. Now, confidentiality, available, and integrity are they're opposing forces sometimes. And when we look at our security and functionality and usability triangle, we know that as we move more towards security, we move away from functionality and usability. So if we then move more towards usability, we're going to detract from our security and functionality. So the risk here, and the risk, or the way to deal with this, is to look at acceptance by the business of what is the compromise towards security, what is the compromise towards functionality, and what is the compromise towards usability. But already I'm talking of compromise of security. There be one of our challenges. Everything is a compromise. Now, we know that there are fines available, and there's plenty of examples out there. But one example is key. A big company, a big organization, over a 5-year period, was relying on a third party to look after their data destruction. And they were relying on this third party to come in and decommission thousands of devices. So that confidentiality there, really key. And the company in question, who was meant to be decommissioning these devices, actually didn't have much experience in it. Had a very inexperienced workforce. And so, yeah, rather awkwardly sold a lot of these so-called decommissioned devices, still with the unencrypted personal data on there, to third parties. Now that really didn't go down very well. And the US Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, did fine that organization many tens of millions of dollars for its failure to safeguard that personal information. And also there were some legal settlements that took place with more tens of millions of dollars. So organizations really feel the effect of a data privacy breach. This is not news, we know this. But then let's look at this into the context of a cloud environment, where, well, in the old days, we didn't really know the huge players out there, the AWSs, the Google Clouds, etc. They weren't as good as they are now, and certainly there are other players out there that were playing in this space. But really that data destruction piece was out of our hands and still remains something we need to be vigilant of. It's great now with the modern ability to certificate that responsibility or transfer the risk to the provider. It's great to have that knowledge that our players are doing this really well, our cloud providers are doing this really well. But if one goes to some of the cloud providers out there that are smaller, new to the game, how do we know that? Because data destruction costs money. And there's always a demand for profit over loss. Now, we do know that data integrity side is crucial. And if we take pharma, for example, pharmaceuticals, we've got regulations in this space that are increasing the data integrity. Now, between 2018 and 2022, there were 2,519 warning letters issued by central regulators to companies involved in pharmaceuticals, just in relation to integrity. So we know that governments are really taking note of this. And of course, in the US, fines are available for up to $1 million. That's a significant fine. So let's just look at who we're securing this against. And what is the environment we're working in? Well, the challenge of the environment is these darned mice. And yet not the small furry rodent that's cute, but actually money, ideology, compromise, and ego. These are the motivators that drive people to want to become an insider threat, to have to become an insider threat, to want to commit crime, to want to monopolize and monetize our data. And we're really in a perfect storm because globally, money's tight. We've got food banks through England and the US. We've got hundreds of thousands of homeless out there. We've got people struggling in the global economy. So we know that money is really tight. And we know that there's an awful lot of ideology and very highly charged ideological thoughts going through the world at the moment. We've had Russia walk through the doors of Ukraine in 2022, causing mixed feelings on both sides. And then COVID. Well, not then COVID, crikey, COVID came before. But this was people who were inside with COVID and were used then to working in a remote environment with conflict happening around them. And these people were picking up on social media and being driven by extremist views and being driven by the algorithms on social media. So that challenges that our threat actors, the numbers are growing. People are getting involved across the world. We've got people compromised left, right, and center. It could be just that good old-fashioned compromise of credentials, or maybe it's a compromise of security keys. But now with the prevalence of info-stealer malware, we know that it's not just that gets compromised, but also a compromise of lifestyle of people. And this can include compromise of lifestyle of our staff, of our domain admins, of people that are key to our infrastructure. And when I say compromise, just consider for a minute that your device is compromised by this stealer malware. And the stealer malware is hoovering up all of the information that you put on that device. It could be where you're logging into your work environment. It could be when you're logging into your Hotmail or your Gmail account. It could be you're logging onto your banking. And these are not great compromises. Or it could be you've just logged onto some porn sites. Yeah, maybe that wouldn't go down well with your other half. Or actually, if you just logged onto a swingers site or even adult friend finder. So that ability for the threat actors to leverage this becomes greater. Or one of the more extreme examples, and I've seen this on the data that we have access to, people logging into child sexual abuse material sites. Well, this can be leveraged everywhere, from state level to hacktivist, to kids on the street that can get hold of this information. So compromise is a real risk, and all paying into this perfect storm. And then, of course, there's ego. Well, we do know that our hacktivist friends at the moment are doing everything they can to get noticed. And everyone from Anonymous Sudan, who were there and then weren't there because the FBI took some out, and some great indictments in the US, and now actually have reared their faces again, all on Telegram, are really busy in that ego space, boosting their ego as how great they are, likely supported by state level in some cases. But a really perfect storm of all that money, ideology, compromise, and ego working together to cause us some problems. And what's the state? What's the size of the problem we're talking about here? Well, the IMF have reported that cybercrime will cost the world $23 trillion in 2027. That is an awful lot of money. That's an awful lot of risk. All of us are securing against that. So let's examine briefly what we're talking about here. We're talking about hybrid cloud and multi-cloud, polycloud. So hybrid cloud, we know it's an IT infrastructure that combines or integrates that private cloud, our on-prem dedicated hosted infrastructure, with the and many things out there like AWS, Azure, GCP, plenty of players out there in that space. And this is a really good opportunity. This is where we started to see the data migration, the digital transformation taking place, and data migration across to well, environments that weren't necessarily in our control, causing challenges. Just examining those key technical components of a hybrid cloud infrastructure. We're looking at on-premises data centers. Great, they're in our own security. We know who's going in there. We know what hard drives we've got in there. We know what RAM what their availability is. And we also know very well that there's going to be a time when we can change that hardware out. And this is all great because it's under our control, our private cloud environment. But then we move it to our public cloud resources, and all of that control disappears. We have to rely on others. And of course, we've got responsibility of the cloud and then the responsibility of security in the cloud. And it's an interesting conversation to have. Our big providers are getting much better of providing certificated security of the cloud. But of course, we're still responsibility for the actions and the setups within the cloud. Now, we do know if we're looking at the integration level into hybrid cloud, we're looking at probably APIs for cross-cloud communication with some VPNs, virtual private networks, chucked in there for good measure. And we'd be looking at connections through many routes, but direct connect, express route services, lots of options there for connections. And then we're bringing in load balancers for traffic distribution, and of course, the superb identity and access management across the environments. And there's lots of orchestration tools for helping here, whether it be through Kubernetes or Terraform or infrastructure as a cloud, lots of different options for managing those cloud platforms. And then, of course, within the hybrid environment, we are looking at monitoring and logging solutions because we need to know what's going on. I'm running through this because I'm knowing you know all this, but I'm trying to highlight all of the challenges that are coming in and just give that reality of the journey that we've come through the different cloud states. Now, common architectures within hybrid cloud could be burst architecture, where really you're running your base workload on a private infrastructure and you're bursting to public cloud during peak demands. And it could be just setting up for the Black Friday traffic and using AWS to take some of that demand. Really useful. Could be data sensitivity splits with sensitive data within our own private cloud environment, and public-facing applications like public clouds taking a lot of the workload that isn't sensitive. And healthcare providers, really using that and keeping patient data on-prem, but running their websites, etc., on public cloud. So you see that split coming through the current environments, but everyone's doing it differently. And no one agrees with the best ways because it's a competitive space. So everything changes all the time with the value, the security, the opportunity, the apps that are available, everything changes. And of course, we could have a dev and test environment, putting that development up into the public cloud for the fast build opportunity that gives us, but keeping production in the private infrastructure. Really good way of enabling fast innovation and fast prototyping whilst maintaining control. But of course, we're already thinking through those challenges. That's a complex security management system. Network latency between the environments is going to become real. And data consistency, of course, as we look across the cloud and our on-prem area, we need to know that the data in both has that integrity. And then we've got to look at skills as a challenge. The skill requirements for running multi-platform approaches are high. And then look at what it costs. We've got to track across those environments to understand the costs, and really understand what it means to the business further data points. So let's have a quick look at multi-cloud, or polycloud as people call it as well. And we're looking here at multiple public cloud providers using combinations of our AWS and Azure, GCP, Oracle Cloud, all these really great providers, and maybe bringing in some of the smaller providers as well, those that are really entering into the space with cost-effective solutions. But are they secure? What level of assurance do we have across those environments? Now, there's always benefits. Fantastic to see the different offerings and the services from each provider. But at what cost? And of course, integration and management across all of those cloud environments is going to be something which is managed by the user. Because cloud providers, funnily enough, when you're with them, they don't want you to use other people because that costs them money. So the key technical components of a distributed cloud service are really that compute resource across the providers, giving us real opportunity, allowing us to maximize the use of each of those cloud places, cloud areas, and allowing us to maximize the cost effectiveness of storage. But they've all got different networking configurations. And all the platforms, the UX, the UI for each of these areas can be complex. Now, of course, again, we're looking at cross-cloud APIs, and we're potentially looking at service mesh implementations to get ourselves working, to get communications happening. We are going to need an integration layer of cloud agnostic tools so that it can cope with the multitude of suppliers out there. And the choice of these tools can be a challenge because cost can be a barrier as well as an enabler. And then we're looking at the benefits of integration, but into databases through a multi-cloud environment with communication and security around those databases, some of which will be holding sensitive information that will cost us those millions of dollars should they get out. And worse, may cost people their lives. And then, of course, the obvious challenges here around the identity federation across those providers is always going to be something which, when one looks at the different providers out there, is a challenge. We look at the management tools available to us with centralized monitoring platforms and cross-cloud security tools, and even bringing in the seams that can cope with the multi-vendor approach. We look at cost management solutions across each of the clouds, but very rarely will they talk to each other. So let's just have a quick examination of some common architectures here. We could look at best of breed, which is using each provider's strongest services for their benefits. An example of this could be using AWS for the compute, using GCP, for example, for some of the stuff they do with AI, and then running into Azure for Microsoft workloads. Really giving us that optimized cost and performance per workload. Really good value. And its availability, and it is focused with applications deployed across multiple clouds and active and passive configurations working well together. It allows the benefit of global load balancing. But unless we get this right, the challenge is, of course, maintaining that. And it allows us to bring in redundancy, getting rid of the challenge of availability at some times. We do know there are many benefits to this, and that can be ways of looking at geographic coverage, and it could look at cost optimization and service availability. But the challenges are still prevalent of complexity of management and the skills required to facilitate the movement of data, the safe movement of data across to the business from the clouds. And then, of course, again, we come into cost tracking, really understanding what those costs are across each of our cloud environments, and then equating that to the business and the benefits to the business of utilizing that cloud. And let's briefly mention security standardization. Well, there really isn't any. We know that all the different providers will call things differently, and they'll put their logs out differently, and they'll assemble their logs in different ways. So a real problem there, and seems not cheap. And again, we look at a challenge of data consistency. We know that we need to have the data consistency right. The integrity has to be right. And so when we work across a multi-cloud facility and multi-cloud infrastructure, the data consistency becomes key. And how do we audit that? How do we check? How do we dip sample that data to ensure that the consistency is there? With the further challenge, of course, of network complexity, and we'll go through this in a little bit. And then, of course, compliance across the providers with their different certification levels and their different certification descriptions. Now, security is key to securing data. That goes without saying. And we therefore need to look at identity management across those clouds and how that works with the different security models and the compliance that we've already spoken through. We need to look at what that inter-cloud connectivity is, what the traffic routing is, and the latency management, and of course, bandwidth costs. And then we look at how we monitor that. What do we do for incident response? What does change management look like when you've got a complex infrastructure? And what are the deployment strategies around the operations? Now, back in the 1980s, in Britain, we had a pop group called Salt and Pepper. And they did a song, but this time we're going to call it Let's Talk About Edge. Edge computing, great stuff. IoT sensors, devices, all the stuff we can see on the slide there, with servers and gateways and nodes and micro data centers, really capitalizing now and starting to capitalize heavily on the 5G network. Absolutely fantastic to have such speed and connectivity around our edge devices. Just quickly looking at that edge infrastructure, we're looking at local processing units and edge caches with their own storage systems, and moving now towards AI and ML, inference engines, allowing them to do their own computing. And then, of course, bringing in edge networking equipment. And we've got some really great examples out there, real-world examples of streaming services now running movies from one central location, but putting servers in local areas. And the content comes from, well, somewhere nearby you, which results in much faster streaming and much less buffering. Or start looking at self-driving cars, processing their own data, and then feeding that data out to infrastructure, as well as taking data in from infrastructure and managing their own safety with that. And they can't afford to wait for data to go to a distant cloud and back to process it. They have to have that capability for that safety factor. And they need to process that information instantly. They're making split-second decisions on sometimes life and death matters. And we've seen some mistakes on that one. But it's important they have that computing power right in the car with them, because, as I say, those split-second decisions are vital. And then if we imagine the smart cities that are really taking off around the world, even traffic lights process data locally. We've got security cameras that analyze footage on site. And this is really reducing delays in response time. And of course, because the computing is done locally, we're not sending data to and from cloud centers, and so it's great for saving internet bandwidth. And we look at the reductions in latency, going down to 1 to 10 microseconds from 50 to 100. So huge reductions in latency and bandwidth optimization. Really great pieces to come through. We know that it gives them the offline capability that we need. But we also know that the technical challenges that come from that include security. It's a distributed security model. The physical device security, identity management, and edge to cloud secure communications, all of which need to be considered. And also, how on edge do we get software updates, firmware updates, and configuration management? We've got to look at hardware redundancy and failover mechanisms within that edge. And then, of course, network resilience and power management. So let's just take pause for a couple of seconds. We consider the challenge is securing our data against, well, mice, really. And we look at the complexity of the environment we're working in. Just take a few seconds to consider your own environments and what the journey is you've been through here. Really difficult journeys, I'm sure. And then consider maybe businesses acquiring new businesses. So there's an inherited issue, because the new business will inherit the infrastructure of the old, the security controls of the old, and the policies which are not usually directly compliant. Then we've got staff changes and onboarding with new access rights and new changed permissions. And then comes integration. And of course, that gets tricky. So let's drill through a few of those top challenges, the moment you've all been waiting for, I'm sure. But let's look at identity and access management complexity. We do know that, well, everyone calls it differently. AWS will call it IAM roles and policies, and it's in JSON. And then Azure, it's role-based access control, RBACs. And then GCP is an IAM roles and binding. It gets fairly inconsistent. And we know that there's inconsistencies across the permissions. So it's really difficult to maintain that least privilege. And then, of course, we've got really complex role mappings. If we look at the challenge of maintaining consistent access policies, it's not just policies within the infrastructure, but organizational policies. And that creates its own problem, its own challenge. Now, we look at a fragmentation problem. We've got different authentication systems per cloud and separate user directories, varying password policies and inconsistent multi-factor authentication. How can we have inconsistent MFA when it's the savior of everything in many cases? And then, of course, we've got implementation risks where users' access is not uniformly secured and credentials are managed differently with security gaps between the systems. And then, of course, we've got PrivEsc, privileged escalation. Users might have different permissions across all the clouds. And really, we've got key concerns here, haven't we? Because you're trying to achieve least privilege, but it's not uniform. We do know that combined permissions could create unexpected access paths, and that can be exploited through the mice. And we do know that, for example, read-only in AWS, but admin in Azure could lead to data exfiltration. Key thoughts on IAM. And how do we bring in a new employee? Well, they have to be created in each cloud and different processes per provider with risk of missteps, and offboarding a leaving employee can risk not offboarding properly. So those policies come as real key challenges. Let's take a quick look at data security and sovereignty. We've got different encryption standards with all the different environments calling it different things. And it could be an HSM, or it could be a different vault, or bring your own keys. Everything is requiring some kind of different approach to key rotation and scheduling. We know that we've got cross-border data transfer compliance requirements, which, when we don't know the sovereignty of the data, it's sometimes hard to understand and remain compliant with. And we do know that, well, the US, the UK, and very many other of our countries are very insistent on their data sovereignty being right. And then, of course, a need for data lifecycle management. How do we weed out the old data? And where do we reduce the risk of leakage between the environments? Let's have a quick look at data security. Security, visibility, and monitoring. We have not got that many unified views across the multiple cloud environments. AWS does it really well in some ways with the Unity, but doesn't cover everything. And then when we look at inconsistent logging and monitoring capabilities, it's really difficult sometimes to keep up. And we've got different security metrics and different correlation of security events, all causing us problems, and all leading to the challenge of a missed security incident. This is something that is going to cost the business its data, and therefore it's going to cost the business money. Take a quick moment to configuration and compliance management, with a diversity again and a challenge of maintaining that compliance and control across all the environments. These are key points to try to achieve unity. But we've got, as always, and as we've said before, risk of misconfigurations. We know that misconfiguration causes a huge problem for data escape, and therefore a fine. And we do have that need for automated compliance checking, but bringing that through a multi-cloud is always going to be a complex beast. And then how do we know our security baseline? And how do we implement that? And how do we deal with the different regulations per cloud provider? Consider for a moment the network security and connectivity side of things. The architecture is complex with multi-clouds. And, oh yeah, we've got a secure intercloud communication, API connections, and everything else that we've already spoken of. It gets really complex. And then we've got risk of exposure through misconfigured networks, missed security policies, everything we can see here as our top challenge. And securing that hybrid cloud interconnection is difficult. But when we get it wrong, incident response and recovery is really difficult. It's a key challenge. And it's a challenge, which, well, coordinating that response across the multiple environment is tough. With consistent backup strategies, which cloud do we back up to and how often? With disaster recoveries, each of our recovery plans need to be consistent, and that in itself causes problems. And of course, let's bring in that root cause analysis. Yeah, we don't know why it went wrong, because probably the full cloud wasn't understood. And we don't like it, so we try to get out, but of course, darn it, vendor lock-in and those security dependencies. We know that there's a reliance on providers really specifying their own security features, and then we've already got the security tool integration challenge, which causes a problem all the time. And if we miss something, yes, we've got that security gap, especially if we're looking at cloud migration, moving to some other vendor. So therefore, we're looking at, well, maybe needing portable security controls, but they're not consistent into each vendor. And yes, there is always the impact of cloud provider outages, which is getting better through the big ones, but still exists. So finishing off, no one knows how to use all of these things, and the skills gap is huge. So we've got recruitment strategies that need to keep up with this fast-changing world, a world where we'd already identified that there were issues, and now we move to one where there's issues that, well, our workforce doesn't know how to solve. So just to finish with, as some key recommendations, it's really around an implementation of a unified identity management process with consistent security policies and deploying that centralized monitoring solution that really helps us do everything, including an automated compliance check. And then developing those comprehensive incident response plans through the business is going to allow us a secure posture with regular security assessments, allowing us to divest that posture as needed. And then, of course, trying to remain vendor agnostic on our security controls, which that's a difficult task. So from me, I hope you've enjoyed the quick journey through what I see as the challenges of securing data across hybrid and multi-cloud environments. And I think we've got a little bit of time for a few questions.
Yeah, we got a lot of questions. Great stuff there. And let's get through those. We have a few minutes, and we'll answer as many as we can. First question comes from Paul in the audience. There's a large and growing gap between the demand for cybersecurity professionals and the supply of qualified candidates to meet the current challenges of enterprise IT/security. Is automation and AI-driven solutions, an essential part, the answer?
That's a really great question, Paul. And the simple answer is no, maybe. Ah, what a great answer that is by that British guy. Well, my reason for saying maybe is really because it comes down to cost. And then it comes down to reliance on automation and AI-driven solutions, which, whilst good, a lot of solutions out there are saying AI and say AI-driven, but yeah, in truth, the AI is minimal and there's holes in that solution. So the bottom line here is getting a workforce you do trust, who are not only those cybersecurity professionals who are qualified to meet the current challenges, but who are also qualified to understand and audit the tools you're bringing in. And if they happen to be an AI-driven solution, then absolutely fantastic. But we as business owners and business staff should not be relying on AI. It is able to see the threat, as long as the threat is presented to it properly. But I still maintain that there is no substitute for a skilled workforce that's constantly going through that continued professional development. And some of that is the security testing and exercising, which we've mentioned in a couple of slides. So I think that's probably the answer of maybe. And I realize I've used the words probably and maybe in the same sentence for an answer. What a great one.
Okay. Next question comes from Lynn in the audience. What are the biggest challenges when it comes to securing data in transit and at rest across different cloud providers?
That's a really great question and absolutely true. The biggest challenge, of course, is keeping it secure. We saw through MoveIt and our ransomware group, Clop, of course, made ransomware boring a couple of years ago in May 23, where effectively they found a 0-day into a piece of software which was used to move data between providers, between customers. Not the only reason, of course, not the only way of moving data, but it shows that a lot of our data movement is done on things which are coming down to rudimentary code. And we did see as a cyber threat intelligence company that whilst some companies out there had encrypted the data before they put it onto this service, an awful lot didn't. So reliance on encryption from a service is in itself a big challenge, because if the service is breached, then that's a problem. But also one could look at APIs and the use of APIs and keys across multi-cloud vendors, and then configuring those APIs to talk to each other and remain secure is in itself a problem. And we know some great places out there to develop APIs. I won't go into the big vendors, we know who they are. But of course, within that environment, we see the revelation of keys that in that dev environment have been left, have been forgotten about. And yeah, that's the encryption broken. And we also know that, well, developers do tend to leave some of our security keys open and available on, well, GitHub and various different places, which with the right scanning can be found. So yeah, lots of problems with that encryption side. And I think that the biggest challenge really is understanding the environment that you're transiting your data in. As long as you understand that environment and you test the environment and you encrypt at rest and in transit as best as you can, then you've done the best you can. But let's face it, security in the current day and age is not if, but when. And that's where we need to stand up to the regulators and say, we did everything we could.
Okay, let's try to squeeze in one more question here from Shrikant in the audience. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. He asked, what is the number one recommendation for threat detection and prevention?
Well, number one recommendation for threat detection, I'm not going to answer that question, because for me, it really depends on the environment. But the one recommendation I'm going to make is visibility. Whether you're in a multi-cloud or a hybrid cloud, or you're using Edge, you've got to have visibility of those logs, and you've got to have a capability to digest them and react to them. So whilst I won't make a recommendation for any product or any solution, visibility is going to allow prevention. So hopefully that gives you an answer to that question and gives some food for thought around what your main aim is going to be when you're deciding on a product or a solution.
Okay, great. Let's wrap up with one more question. What are the primary data governance risks in hybrid cloud deployments?
Well, really, I think on this one, we're looking at tracking data location. Governance is all about the sovereignty and managing that data lifecycle. And so for me, I think tracking data location and managing data lifecycles is really key. But also we've got to look at ensuring that there's consistent data protection policies across the multiple cloud platforms, which is really always going to be key. And I mentioned policies during the conversation and during the presentation, because it's going to always create significant governance complexities in what we're doing. Organizations really do struggle with maintaining comprehensive data tracking and compliance. So building that from the beginning of your journey into data and data storage is the solution to providing good governance and to really understanding what data you've got and how you use it, and hopefully how you don't lose it.
All right, well, great stuff. Thanks again, Chris, for that fantastic presentation and answering all those questions.
Thanks, David. Great to be here.
Check out those resources in your console, but don't go too far. Our next session is right around the corner. We'll be right back.
Welcome back. We hope you're finding today's summit insightful and engaging. I'm Chris Paoli, and I'll be your moderator for this second session. Before we get started, another huge thank you to our sponsor Rubrik for supporting this summit and this community. Our next session is called Future-Proofing Cyber Resilience, Automated Recovery, Intelligent Threat Mitigation, and Beyond. And we're thrilled to have John O'Neill Sr. here to share his expertise. During his 30-plus years in the IT industry, John O'Neill Sr.'s roles have ranged from software architect to senior executive consultant to author. He's been involved in everything from multinational networking, messaging, and communications projects to ERP, HRIS, and security operations. He's a 6-time recipient of the Microsoft MVP Award, including an MVP in security, has developed technology training coursework, and written numerous books and articles. The floor is yours, John.
Thank you so much, Chris. I appreciate that great introduction, and I appreciate being here with everyone. This is one of my favorite things to do, is to get together with other IT pros and stakeholders and talk about the challenges that are in front of us, the lessons learned from behind us, and to kind of take it to the next level with each other. So with that, let me go ahead and jump into a quick little overview of what we're going to cover in this session. We're going to talk a bit about the current cyber threat landscape. We have data, for instance, from the 2024 IBM security report that shows that there's been a 94% increase in sophisticated attacks. And we'll talk about what that means in a little bit. We have the evolution of automated recovery systems to dive into. For instance, companies such as Morgan Stanley are really achieving high levels of recovery success using automated systems. Some data shows that they have up to 99.99% success, which is, great. Almost unbelievable, but awesome. We're going to look at our intelligent threat detection and response systems and techniques, policies, procedures, all that kind of thing. Of course, we've got to touch on zero trust. I know a lot of us maybe are a little bit overdone with talk of zero trust over the past few years, but it is still as relevant and foundational a concept as it ever has been. So we'd be remiss not to talk about it. And, just looking at things like Microsoft's own implementation of a ZTA, they have reduced their breach impact by their data by 95%. So, we're not talking a little bit here. We're talking almost all, and that's great. And then, of course, we're going to get into artificial intelligence powered security operations, so AI and ML, machine learning. This is really important to all of us. We see a lot of this in use, particularly in financial markets. For instance, MasterCard says that they're preventing $20 billion in fraud annually through AI analysis, right? And that wasn't even a thing a few years ago for them. So it's a great evolution. Well, with that kind of overview, let's jump right into looking at what we've got going on in the 2025 threat landscape here. So, ransomware as a service. We've talked about this a number of times over the past few years, but it's continuing to evolve. And this is, where we have organizations, and they can be criminal organizations, they can be individuals. There's actually marketplaces for this where they've developed the tools and techniques to deploy and execute ransomware against organizations, and they sell it to folks. Sometimes for an outright payment, other times for a percentage of the ransom gain. It doesn't really matter what their payment is. The fact of the matter is they're empowering people without the sophistication to develop ransomware to actually become ransomware criminals. And it is continuing to evolve. I mean, Lockbit 4.0 caused over $300 million in damage in the financial sector in Q1 2024 alone. So in a 3-month period, at the beginning of last year, we saw almost approaching $500 million worth of impact to one sector. That doesn't include, manufacturing and all the healthcare and all the other industries that are affected by ransomware as a service. So that's important to understand as one of the things we have to really focus on preventing and establishing resilience against. We have, of course, many new AI-powered attack vectors. So, the attack vectors conventionally were pretty easily identified once they, became apparent, and then prepped against and trained against and all these different things. And they took some time. So we didn't see like rapid evolution of new attack vectors. Well, now with artificial intelligence doing it, we see radical rates of new attack vectors coming out. And they're, of course, learning from themselves, from their successes and failures and that sort of thing. So, this is crazy because we see things like the AI attack chain that went against Deutsche Bank, however you pronounce that. I'm not a great pronouncer of that. But anyways, there were millions of dollars that were at risk there. And luckily they had some good defense mechanisms to help fend off it being worse than it actually was. But the fact of the matter is it's there and it's growing. Supply chain. This is something that, we really started talking about a couple years ago with the SolarWinds attack, but, it's become much more sophisticated over the course of 2024, and it's expected to gain even more sophistication in 2025. Just look at the NVIDIA software compromise, right? How many of us use NVIDIA solutions in the computers in our environments? And it doesn't really matter what sector you're in. I'm pretty sure we all have computers with NVIDIA GPUs in them somewhere in our organization. And, that compromise affected over 2 million GPUs worldwide. So, crazy numbers of GPUs in all different sectors affected by this supply chain attack. Cloud attacks. More and more organizations are expanding their hybrid infrastructures, architectures. Almost every organization, certainly I would say 99.999% of the ones I deal with through consulting are in a hybrid mode where they have some resources in the cloud and some on-prem, and they tend to be expanding those cloud resources. Nobody really, is doing lift and shift like we talked about 5 years ago or whatnot, unless, you're kind of greenfield, new organization, that sort of thing. But in any case, those of us that are moving to specifically infrastructure as a service, where, we're running cloud-based VMs and networks, firewalls, that sort of thing, well, we're seeing a lot more cloud native attacks going on at these things. For instance, AWS reported a 400% increase in the amount of sophisticated, what they consider sophisticated cloud native attacks. So that's crazy. First off, I'm not a big fan of, the greater than 100% thing, but we get it. 400% increase. And then finally, let's talk about infrastructure as a whole, on-prem, that sort of thing. And I want to drill into specifically the infrastructure that really drives our lives. So power, water, wastewater treatment, trucking for food delivery, all those kind of things. Things that we saw how delicate they are during the COVID epidemic, where, things started to break down and people had to live life without toilet paper for a day and a half. But anyways, I would digress. We can look at a recent breach in Singapore where the attacker actually got into the water distribution system and attempted to manipulate the pH level. Imagine the real world impact of something like that, where a ransomware attack or a cyber attack could disrupt the quality of water for a large swath of a geographic region, or disrupt water treatment, so sewage plants, shut off power. I mean, there's just crazy amount of things, and we all like to convince ourselves that, oh, this isn't really a big threat or whatever. I want to remind you that at least in the U.S., many of the nuclear power plants are still controlled by COBOL-based systems. So let that think in for a minute when we talk about resilience to attack. All right. Now we get into the good stuff here, our evolution of automated recovery. So the first point in the title of this session, automated recovery. Right? Let's, kind of walk through some of these things quickly. And we're going to talk about, next-gen, air-gapped, orchestration. And I'm going to spend a bit of time really diving into immutable, because this is a very important, but also a possibly dangerous, when implemented wrong, technology solution. So next-gen backup, what do we have there? Well, we have organizations that we can look at as key examples, such as JP Morgan, right? JP Morgan Chase, the financial sector, again, coming into play here. And their next-gen backup and recovery solution has them achieving a 15-minute recovery time. So the RTO here is crazy good and very important for them, because they're dealing with transactions and customer service facing systems and everything else that, when they're down, they cost millions and hundreds of millions of dollars every minute. So that's really important that we continue to evolve those things. I'm going to skip over immutable and come back to that. And jump into air-gapped. And this is really important because, we've all seen the data about ransomware and how attackers are in the system for over 200 days on average, basically moving horizontally and vertically through all the different systems so that they can shut down as much as possible. And this ties to the immutable storage, but it's a bit different when we are talking about air-gapped recovery systems. What I'm really talking about here are systems where we have in place a cold site, warm site type environment, although in many cases it's virtualized, but it is completely independent and has no physical or logical connectivity to the primary data centers and systems, cloud resources, all that kind of thing. Why is that important? Because as you clean things and recover things, you need a known, safe, secure place to put them. Otherwise, you're just putting them back in to get reinfected and that sort of thing, right? It's kind of like jumping into a nasty pond and getting a sinus infection and clearing it up and then deciding to go swimming in that same nasty pond a week later. It doesn't make any sense. So we need to, go swimming in a nice, clean lake in that case. And we have examples here where we're really looking at what is the recovery success rate. In other words, the rate at which once we recover it, it stays recovered. It doesn't get reinfected or re-ransomed, however you want to look at it or say it. And we have organizations that are achieving up to, that 5 nines of recovery success rate in 2024, and we expect that to continue in 25. Failover. It isn't enough for modern organizations to, have a playbook where they kind of start flipping through pages and manually going down a checklist to fail over. That's the way we've done it in the past. Of course, that's the way that, the Apollo missions, they did, Apollo 11, for those that are space history buffs, when they had their emergencies, right? They worked through checklists and that sort of thing. Well, the problem is that takes a lot of time. Time is money, and time is system availability for things like critical infrastructure and that sort of thing. It's the one resource that is almost the most valuable to us is time, because everything else flows from it. And therefore, we really need to automate the failover so that when something happens, we know that minimal time is taking place between when that happens, when the event occurs, and when we fail over to our other mechanisms. I deal a lot with Microsoft Azure, and there's a great case study on BMW's Azure Site Recovery implementation, where they have, using automated failover mechanisms and configurations, achieved a 99.999, so that 5 nines of availability that everybody seeks. And I mean, 5 nines has been talked about as the holy grail in manufacturing for decades. We can use the same metric in IT. Orchestration, so, making sure that we predefine what is going to take place with our recovery, and AI gets involved here where we can add artificial intelligence to the intelligence that we're providing the system and really cut down on our recovery time. And when I say cut down, I don't mean, improve by 10% or 15%. I'm talking 80, 85, 90% improvement in recovery times. So now back to that immutable storage. And my favorite example of this right now is Netflix, because they protect over 100 petabytes of data, crazy amounts of data, right? And their storage implementation, according to what they report, has had 0 compromises of the storage system itself. So I'm not talking about other systems at Netflix or that sort of thing. I'm talking about the storage system itself. And we're going to talk more about the details of immutability later. And again, why I say some of it's risky. But for those of you that are unfamiliar, the term immutable simply means non-changeable, right? So it's something that ransomware attackers, doesn't matter, they can't change it because it is protected from change. Simple enough to say, but hard to accomplish. How about those AI-powered attack vectors that we mentioned? Let's talk quickly about some of what we're seeing. We have ML model poisonings. So where, Microsoft publishes a great digital defense report and other data, And, one of the things that they're focusing on model poisoning of is the compromising of facial recognition systems, so biometric systems. And, AI has been deployed heavily into passwordless and that sort of thing to make it easier for us to use biometrics and other technologies. But the problem with that is those models that AI is learning from, if an attacker can get in and poison them and tailor them, they can actually teach them to do the bad thing. And that's an attack vector we really didn't have to worry about before. The AI solutions, now we're going to talk about a positive. So on the opposite side of the attack, in the defense area, we have vulnerability discovery, right? How do we protect against something we don't know? And I've said that for years. When I first got into IT team management, one of the little quotes that they would always throw back at me that I would use constantly to the team was, it's not what you know that tends to get you in trouble, it's what you don't know. And they're like, that's great common sense. And I'm like, yeah, but we don't spend enough time trying to reduce what we don't know. And AI is really the game changer in this. For instance, Google's AI is finding 0 days 200% faster than previous human discovery. So that is really good, and it's increasing by the day. So as long as we can keep that on the upswing to where vulnerabilities are identified and remediated, obviously that's the second part of it, quicker than ever before, we reduce our exposure. And, we good old social engineering, the, Kevin Mitnick era technique. A lot of people new in IT don't even know that name, but as one of the early hackers, his success was based in great part to social engineering, getting people to give him information they shouldn't give him. And unfortunately, AI has provided a huge boost to this. I don't know if you've gone out and played, any of you, with some of the sites that are available, but there are tools out there where you can use AI to create videos of yourself, to replace your image with another image, that sort of thing. And let's talk about how this is done. Well, we have this scenario where we have, the CEO and those emails that would always come out, the phishing emails to get people to, buy me gift cards and send me the numbers and everything else. Well, hopefully we've trained our users to avoid a lot of those. But if they actually get a call from the CEO with the CEO's voice telling them to do it, how many of them do you think are going to fall for that now? And we have actual recorded proof of where an AI system took less than 3 minutes worth of audio and was able to produce a perceptually indistinguishable audio of that person saying what they typed in, what the attacker typed in. So essentially, I call up and talk to the CEO, whatever, telling him about a charitable organization or, new product, however I get through to that person, and I record some audio of them. And now I can AI generate audio that, sounds like him asking somebody to go get gift cards. And, I expect that that's going to be a big problem for us in 25 and 26, because it's not just audio. We now can do it, like I said, with video. So let's go away from the phone call. What if they were to get a, Teams call or FaceTime, whatever, And it's actually a video of the CEO. Looks just like them, moves just like them, sounds just like them. They're going to fall for that. And we need to be able to defend against that. Unfortunately, right now, I don't feel like there are as good as developments in the protection side as there are in the attack side. So we really need to keep an eye on that. And that goes right along into the behavior mimicking and, password cracking. This is important to mention because we've long relied on encryption and all these different things about, hey, this prevents our password from being cracked or that sort of thing. We're going to use passphrases. We're going to use all this different kind of thing. Well, as quantum computing is developed, we're not there yet, but that is like the current holy grail for AI teams is to develop true quantum computing. Well, we've already seen that a quantum AI hybrid cracking system can essentially crack 64-character passwords in hours. So, this is a real problem because we're still fighting users to get them to not reuse passwords and do proper password hygiene. And we're going to get into where even those that have tough, long passwords are going to be at risk. So this is where passwordless really comes in. I'm going to speed it up here a little bit because we got a lot of ground to cover yet. And I'm going to look a little bit at supply chain attack prevention. We've got a lot of things going on from risk assessments, Pfizer, healthcare. They are currently using intelligent systems to assess more than 10,000 suppliers automatically and regularly. So, it's not good enough to just do a one and done assessment of your supply chain. You need to continually be revisiting this. This requires a lot of care and feeding, and this is where automation really comes in to help. And, vendor security requirements. This is a big one in 24 and for 25, as far as I'm concerned. Our organizations need to start documenting, putting pen to paper, whatever you want to say, the requirements we have for our vendors when it comes to cybersecurity. For those of you that know, I do a lot with cyber insurance, and I can tell you that many of the underwriters are starting to require that you have vendor cybersecurity requirements that meet or exceed their expectations for you. And that's a big one. Example there, AMD. Talked about NVIDIA, might as well talk about AMD. They have a vendor security program that they've been implementing and evolving, and they tell us that it's achieving a 98% compliance rate within their supply chain. So that's huge and very important to, safety and success in the future. Now, remember we talked a bit about cloud infrastructure security when we talked about what we're going to cover today. And, this is kind of where the rubber hits the road, because I'm going to use the analogy of, the infrastructure are the highways and byways that power our IT systems. So might as well, mix metaphors and euphemisms and all that kind of thing. But anyway, identity and access management, this is one of the areas where I see organizations really fall short, right? They're really falling short in what they need to do to properly make sure that they're verifying and controlling who's accessing the system, when, how, for how long, all those kind of things. So that's super important. And you need to, in many cases, use automated tools to help with this. That's the biggest complaint that I run into from orgs is, hey, we have tens of thousands of users. We just can't possibly be doing these recommendations. And my point is this is where automation comes in, right? Let's spend a little extra time creating the automation up front so that the repetitive task is then taken care of for us. So huge deal there. Multi-cloud. As I said, everybody continues to, work themselves towards moving more and more up into the cloud from their on-premise to these hybrid environments. Well, part of that, they're engaging multiple cloud providers, sometimes for resiliency, sometimes simply for economics, sometimes for performance. Doesn't really matter the reason why it's happening. So you need to implement data protection strategies and solutions that work across all the different providers, whether it be AWS, Google Cloud, Azure, whatever. And, a good example here, Airbnb uses a unified encryption methodology across their resources that are deployed in multiple cloud providers. So that's a big one there. Critical infrastructure. Remember, I kind of really focused on this when I talked about our power, water, those sorts of things. So I do consider this really important because we're seeing a proliferation of IoT type devices in the industrial environment, and a lot of the industrial engineers, whether they be mechanical, electrical, whatever, are not security focused. So everybody remembers when Bill Gates and Microsoft made the big promise to be security first and that sort of thing. I mean, that was a long time ago. Unfortunately, it didn't extend out into our industrial operations, and that makes them one of the weakest points in our infrastructure. And it's crazy to think about because it seems like an oxymoron. If you're a power grid, a utility company, your ability to provide power is the most important thing you do. Well, if the industrial systems are compromised and affected by an event, you're not doing that. And it goes right to commercial organizations too. You're a manufacturing organization and your machines aren't going up and down anymore because the automation driving them has been compromised, right? Warehouses, forklifts now all use these little IoT devices to keep track where they are and where inventory is and how to move so we can move faster and better than ever before. Well, you shut that down and you got a big problem. So what do we do there? Well, we're starting, luckily, to see some systems being developed. GE is a big provider of industrial IoT solutions, and they currently have a framework that is protecting and securing, over 1 million devices of their newest devices, keeping them, at a high level of uptime. Not 5 nines yet, but 3 nines, and that's a plus. Huge caveat there is that they tend to only focus on the new ones, and not many organizations, none that I know of, are able to run out and drop tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars to just replace the industrial control systems they have, simply because, the new ones have security and the old ones don't. The cost benefit analysis just isn't there, and that that's not a sale to the board or the C-suite that I've seen successfully happen. Let's jump forward here and talk a bit about automated recovery fundamentals, and then some immutable storage and air gap protection. So automated recoveries. Of course, we have our recovery point and our recovery time objectives, RTO, RPO. Many, if not all of you, have probably heard those terms thrown around. They've been, a foundational part of every DR plan for the last 2 decades at least. And what do they really mean? Well, the recovery point is, typically defined as the amount of data that you can lose without a catastrophic loss or catastrophic impact to the organization. So, hey, if I lose more than 24 hours worth of data, I can't recover. Well, you better have less than a 24-hour RPO, because otherwise, what's the point? Recovery time is similar, but it deals with the time it takes you to recover that data. So let's say that our RPO is, I can't lose more than the last 12 hours worth of data. And, that represents 100 terabytes worth of data. Let's say it's some big amount like that. And our backup and recovery systems, only recover a terabyte an hour. We're never going to really get back up in time to avoid a catastrophe. And the recovery time is how long we can take to get that data back. And often it is much less than the RPO. So if we have a 24-hour RPO of data loss, so 1 day's worth of data I can lose, often the recovery time objective is, hey, you got to be back up in an hour because we're not serving customers until you're back up. So the RTO can be quite a bit, and usually is quite a bit less. A couple examples of these. We have financial sector examples. Amex is achieving what they claim to be 30-second RPO across their global operations. And when you say 30 seconds, heck, how do you even know about it in 30 seconds? It's automated. That's the benefit, right? Let's automate it. Let's power it with AI and watch the magic happen, right? And they're seeing that. Bank of America, on the other side, for the RTO, they've established a 5-minute RTO for their critical systems. So they've said, hey, we cannot be down longer than 5 minutes. So make sure that our systems are recoverable within that amount of time. And that's huge. Since I'm really hammering on the financial sector, as far as automation goes, since we've talked about how important that is, Visa has implemented orchestration to do 1,000+ daily recovery tests. So they're testing, right? Because we all know that a backup doesn't count unless it's been validated, tested. So if you're not doing test recoveries, test restores of your backup system, you might as well figure you don't have a backup system. Because I'm Irish, that's the O'Neill, and my Irish luck tells me that if there's a 50-50 chance that it'll be recoverable or not recoverable, that means I have a 99% chance of it not being recoverable. I don't tell people I don't have luck, it's just all bad. Immutable storage, here we are. This is what I really wanted to get into and talk about. How do we make these systems to where they're unchangeable? Well, we use technologies like Worm, write once, read many. So the media is able to be written to only one time, but then can be read back many, 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 many times. This doesn't obviously work well for things that are rapidly changing, but things that are accessed and viewed and read more than they're changed, it's a great technology to use for that. It's a great technology to use for our backup systems. We have, blockchain-based storage. You see a lot of that again in the financial sector, where they have, billions of transaction records that they need to secure. And, you have a lot of solutions playing in this market space. So you really need to do due diligence on choosing the right one for you. But I do caution you against simply taking their word for it, right? Just because they say it's immutable, this is a trust but verify situation here. You need to go make sure that. And if they say it's software immutable, I have strong concerns over software immutability. I'm not saying I don't use them, but I'm cautiously optimistic about their implementation. Let's put it that way. Why is that? Well, if we think about all the attacks and the breaches that we're trying to prevent, they tend to all involve compromising software we didn't think was compromisable. And so what stops them from compromising the software that pretty much, creates the immutable storage? So this is where I really like to involve some level of true air gapping, and it can involve physical air gaps. So I have backup systems that are immutability is as straightforward as once every given time period, has to be within the RPO, obviously. A network port is enabled, a backup occurs, and then that network port is disabled when the backup is done, so that it is essentially physically air gapped. And there are levels of complexity here that can be used to create extra immutability. And what I mean by that is, hey, we know that a lot of ransomware attacks and that sort of thing, they're in the system for quite some time. So what do? Well, we have a redundant backup system that's on another network infrastructure, if you will. And the same kind of thing happens at a different schedule to move a copy of the backup from the primary backup system to the other backup system. So you've essentially got Sally ports like they use in prisons to move your backup data through. And it creates some good physical air gap implementations. And you see a lot of that in things that are involved in critical industries such as defense, healthcare, that area. We have logical air gap solutions. And, this is where we implement software to, essentially create separation between our production data and our DR data or our replicas, that sort of thing. Don't forget, you got to protect the transfer protocols and the things you use to move them. So we can't just protect our data at rest. We've got to protect it while it's being transferred. And, this typically involves creating or implementing a secure transfer framework so that the data can't be changed while in flight. Remember, the chain is only as strong as its weakest link. So you have to think of every link that's in your chain from cradle to grave, if you will, and make sure that they are all just as strong, or plan for your breach to center around the weakest one. That's your overall strength is simply the weakest link. mentioning ZTA earlier, I want to dive a bit more into that, just because a lot of this is reminder, but it's worth reminding. My feeling is, when it comes to zero trust and zero trust architecture, you really need to never trust and always verify. So this isn't trust but verify. This is never trust. I always assume breach. I always assume attack, right? And I always verify. So whatever it is that's coming in, I validate it. I ensure that it is what it says it is and that it has the rights to do what it wants to do and that sort of thing. And that's, of course, where the principle of least privilege, or as I love to say, polyp, comes in. This is a super old concept, but it's one that many organizations I come across still fail miserably at. And usually there's some excuse of, well, I'm not going to tell the CFO that they can't have access to everything, or I'm, too overworked. I just need to give admin access and let it run away. I've had this argument for years with developers, and it is more important than ever now. They say, oh, my app only runs with admin privileges. Remember that industrialized solution slide that we talked about? They're famous for this. Okay, it has to run as a user with admin rights. No, it doesn't. I guarantee you it does not have to run with admin rights. It does not need to be able to start and stop the bit service on my machine. And they go, what's the bit service? And I say, exactly. If you don't know what it is, you obviously don't need rights to it, which means you don't need admin rights. You don't need the right to do everything. The only reason you're saying that is because you haven't invested the time or resources to determine exactly what it is your application does need. And there are tools that help us do that now. Unfortunately, we have to take the burden on of doing that, where our vendors aren't necessarily doing it. And remember, we talked about having vendor security requirements. That's one of them that I often put in, and it's a standard they don't like, but I push them hard to agree to it, is that they will identify and document the true privileges that the solution they're providing me needs. Well, with that, I want to make sure we have time for a couple questions here. So I'm going to close it out and jump to the Q&A. And I'll ask Chris if he wants to throw a question, or would rather I just run down through them.
Oh, no, I'm happy to pitch them to you, John. Thanks for the great talk so far. Yeah, let's get through a few questions here before our third session. Paul wants to know, what are the risks from data exfiltration through attacks on AI models and their data?
So, great question. I'm really impressed, Paul. Thank you. There are a number of risks associated with the data exfiltration involved with AI. Sorry, I'm really running my mind through your question because there's so many different points to cover here. But, the one thing that I want to mention first is the rate of data exfiltration. Think about it. When you have an AI-powered attack, you are dealing with something that can make decisions, learn at unprecedented rates, like nothing a human could obviously do. Well, so they're also powering the movement of data, the identification of data, all of that kind of important protected asset that you have, and they can grab it much faster. And I know your question dealt specifically with, hey, I have my own internal AI models that are learning our data and providing AI chatbots to our users or customers or that sort of thing. And I'm getting to that. just, anybody that knows me knows I have to take the long way. It's a character flaw. When we look at that and we implement these systems, and I help a lot of organizations implement AI, as it's implemented, it becomes relied on much faster than you expect. So when you put a system in place and it's good, people start using it. And once they see what it can do, they push it and they see what it can do beyond what they thought it could do, and so on and so forth. Well, that means that they're plugging a lot of key information into the model that's making this thing so powerful for them. And this is one of the reasons why, for instance, Microsoft's 365 Copilot, their pro version, their paid, I shouldn't say paid because there's a non-pro version that's paid, but we'll say their pro version involves creating a model that uses your data, your SharePoint resources and that sort of thing, but never sends it up to the web. So it's never exposed there because, it's bad enough to think about exfiltrating that critical data from your on-prem or cloud-based, but your private stuff to, hey, it's in a public environment, and now I got to worry about that environment being assaulted and extracted, and that is something to think about, obviously. We always have to play the bad guy in our mind, and essentially we're red teaming in our own thoughts. And when we implement new technologies to enhance the operations of our organization, we really need to, make sure we're thinking about how they could be used against us. So thanks again for that question, Paul.
Yeah, that was a great question that took most of our Q&A time. Let's see if we can get one or two more questions in here. Given the rise in quantum computing capabilities, how should organizations prepare their encryption and key management systems to be quantum resistant?
Wow. That is...
Delve into your crystal ball on this one.
Right? That's you really got me there. That's a good one. So I have to reread that question because there's a lot in that. And there we are. So the advice here to keep it kind of the TLDR version is that there are a number of papers and points that say, hey, this is what we expect to see in quantum computing over the next few years and that sort of thing, as far as what encryption levels you should be using and security techniques like passwordless, that sort of thing. You need to look at those and make sure you're trying to stay on the front of that curve, if you will. So, we mentioned that they're already proving that they can crack 64-character passwords. Now would be a good time to be implementing passwordless and other technologies to get in front of that.
With that, that's all the time we have for Q&As. Thanks for the great talk, John.
Hey, it was really my pleasure, Chris. Thanks for letting me come in and be part of these great summits. I really appreciate it. Everybody have a great day.